Hey guys, welcome back to the YouTube channel Programming Knowledge. In today's Microsoft Excel tutorials video, we are going to see that how can we record macros in Microsoft Excel. But before that, one important thing that you need to understand is what is a macro. So a macro in simple terms can be defined as a set of instructions or commands that are given by the user to the Excel, and when those are recorded, then it is called a macro. So macro is basically a set of the commands or the actions performed by the user that is recorded in Microsoft Excel. Now the question comes, why do we need macros? So the need of the macros lies in the fact that many a times while working on Excel sheets, there are some steps which need to be performed multiple times. These are the same steps which may be lengthy and need to be performed on multiple sheets. So instead of performing those steps individually, what you can do is just create a macro out of it and just run it multiple times so that those actions could be performed in a very concise manner. And one advantage of macro is it could be run multiple times in multiple sheets and in multiple locations as well. So that is the advantage of macros. Now after understanding about macros, let us understand that how can we create them. So here in my sheet I have already created a macro, and this macro is known as test macro. So I'm going to show you its usage. First of all, I'm going to create a new sheet over here. Then when you have created a new sheet and you want to perform the same steps that were performed in this sheet 1. Now what does this macro contains is it contains all these steps which are required to make this table with 2 columns, months and days. Now if I go to sheet 5 and I just try to run this macro, how can I do that? First of all, go to the view tab. Then here you will find an option called macros. When you just select on it, then there is an option of view macros. You can just go to it and there you will find test macro, and this name test macro I have given to it. So you gotta select the macro that you want to run and then just click on run. And you can see that in sheet 5 all the steps that were recorded in the macro were performed as it is, and the result has been duplicated over here without much effort. Now there is another way of running a macro, and that is through a shortcut. So just you can create a new sheet, and to run a macro, what you got to do is while creating it, you can provide a shortcut key. And for this test macro, the shortcut key that I provided was Ctrl+Shift+S. So when you want to run your macro, you can simply press its shortcut key. So here I'm pressing Ctrl+Shift+S, and as soon as I pressed it, all the steps or whatever the instructions were recorded in the macro have been duplicated over here. So this is how you can just run the macros. Now the question arises that how can we create a macro? So for creation of the macro, what you got to do is just perform very simple steps, because macro creation is nothing but it's just like recording something. So how can you do that? To record a macro, first what you got to do is go to this view tab. Here you will find this macros option. Just expand it, and here you will find an option of record macro. So you can just click on it, and as soon as you do that, you will see that this kind of a menu bar or a dialog box is in front of you, and it asks for some requirements. It has some requirements like the macro name. Now you can give the macro a name, and this name can be anything you want, but it is advisable that you give a name that helps you to understand that what macro it's going to be used for. So now what I'm going to do is just create a table with serial number up to 1 to 12, and then I'm going to arrange the months like January, February, etc. into the second column. So I'm going to create a 2-column table, so that is why I'm going to name it as month macro, month_macro. And the reason I have used this underscore instead of a space is because you cannot use spaces in a macro name. and that is a convention, that is a naming convention that you got to keep in mind while naming a macro. Then it asks for a shortcut key, and this step is optional. You can give it a shortcut key or you can just omit it, but here I'm going to give it a shortcut key. Since there are many of the shortcuts that are already predefined in Microsoft Excel, like Control C for copy, Control V for paste, and so on, so we cannot give them as the shortcut keys. So we have to come up with something different. And one simple way of doing that is just press any letter along with the shift key. Like in the previous macro, we had Control Shift S as the shortcut key. So over here, I'm going to provide it with, Control is already written, so I'm going to provide it with Shift T. So as soon as I press Control Shift T, this shortcut key would be activated, and whatever I do in my macro would be repeated. Now the next question it asks is where you want to store this macro. So the options are this workbook, personal macro workbook, or a new workbook. This tells us that a macro is workbook dependent. If you have created some macros in this particular workbook, then they are stored in this workbook, then only they could be used in this workbook only and not in any other workbook. So that is why I'm going to just click on this workbook. Then you can provide it with a description. This description is optional, and it is used for a better understanding of what the macro does, just as the commands in Microsoft Excel. So I'm just going to provide it with month's name and serial number. So this is my macro description. You can provide anything in your macro description, and then you can just click on OK. Now once you click on OK, you can see over here that this is a button present over here which tells us that a macro is currently recording, and if you want, you can just stop its recording from over here only. Also, you can see that when you expand this macro, then this stop recording button is present over here, so you can just stop the recording of the macro from over here only. Now one important thing is that the macro only captures the steps that you do in itself. Like first of all, what I'm going to do is provide it with a serial number SNO. Then I'm going to provide it with another column heading, that is month. Then I'm going to provide the data in serial number like 1, 2. Then I'm going to select them together. Up to 12, and for the month I'm going to provide it with Jan and expand it up to December like this. Then I'm going to select them both, go to the home tab and provide it with a particular background color like this, and the rest of these I'm going to provide with a particular background color of say a shade of gray. Then to all these I'm going to provide a border like this. So this is what I want to be recorded in my macro. Apart from that, I'm just going to select it all and provide it with a center alignment like this. Now this is what I want in my macro, and then I'm going to click on this button to stop recording it, or I can just go to the view tab, and in macros I can stop it from recording. So now a new macro has been created with all these steps already recorded in it. Now how can we use this? Suppose we go to some new sheet over here. Then we can just go to this macros, view macros, and you can see that month macro is created. You can just click on run, and you can see that the macro has been duplicated as it is. Furthermore, you can also go to sheet 1, and here also you can just reproduce this macro, and this time what I'm going to do is use the shortcut Control Shift T, and you can see that the macro has been reproduced over here as well. So this is how you can just create a macro and reproduce it. Now another thing is, suppose you have already recorded a macro, you can just go to this view macros tab. Now I have already recorded this macro, test macro and month macro. Now what if I want to just delete my macro? Then what can I do? I can just select this macro which I want to delete. Then I can just go to this delete option, and this macro would be deleted. It would ask you a question that you want to delete this macro. Then I click on yes, and this macro is now deleted. Now if I just create a new sheet and provide it with a shortcut that was Ctrl+Shift+S, then you can see that nothing happens. And the reason is the macro that we had created, the test macro, has already been deleted. Now you can just go to this view macros tab and see it for yourself that the test macro is not present over here, only the month macro is present. Now in the month macro also, you can see that when you select on it, this is this description tabs, which shows that month's name and serial number. That was the description that we gave to it. Now if you can just one more thing, if you can just run it, then you can see that it has been produced, because that macro is present over in the memory of the workbook, while the test macro was not present, so that's why its shortcut key is now invalid. Now one thing that you must have noticed is that whenever we click on macro, what it does is that it produces the output in the column I4, in the cell I4. It starts from here. So what if you want to produce it at some other place? How can you do that? So for that, what you got to do is make sure that the relative referencing is turned on in macros. So how can we do that, and how can we create macros out of relative referencing is what we are going to see in the next video. That is all in today's video, in which you learn that how can you create macros, how can you delete macros, how can you create a shortcut using the macros. So that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.